Most people imagine the fall of Rome as a dramatic event, something loud and sudden marked by fires, invasions, and chaos, but that picture is comforting because it suggests collapse is obvious when it happens, in history almost never works that way. Rome did not collapse when its borders were breached or when emperors became corrupt or when citizens lost faith. Rome collapsed much earlier, quietly, when the financial structure that held the empire together stopped working the way it once had. And by the time the visible signs appeared, the outcome had already been set in motion for generations. What makes Rome dangerous to study today is not the violence at the end but the calm logic that preceded it, because when you strip away the marble statues, the Latin names and the ancient context, the mechanics of Rome's decline feel unsettlingly modern. Rome began as a system built on restraint. Early Roman society was fiscally conservative not because it wanted to be, but because it had to be. Resources were limited, wars were costly, and expansion was justified only when it paid for itself. Soldiers were citizens, not permanent professionals, and public spending remained closely tied to tangible gains. When Rome expanded, it expanded profitably. Conquered territories brought land, labor, taxes, and tribute that strengthened the state. Growth covered costs. For a long time, this model worked exceptionally well. Rome's financial strength was a consequence of its discipline and its ability to align incentives across society. But success changed the system. As Rome transformed from a republic into an empire, its cost structure evolved in ways that were subtle but irreversible. Armies became permanent. Borders stretched thousands of miles. Bureaucracies multiplied. Infrastructure had to be maintained across continents. Urban populations grew and required grain subsidies to remain stable. Rome became expensive not because it was wasteful, but because scale demanded it. This was the turning point. Because Rome's expenses were no longer temporary or optional, they became structural. When expansion slowed, Rome faced a problem it had never needed to solve before: how to sustain a massive, permanent system without the financial windfall of conquest. The initial responses were reasonable. Taxes were adjusted. Wealthy elites were asked to contribute more. The state borrowed against future revenues. None of this felt dangerous at the time. In fact, it felt responsible. Rome was not reckless. It was adaptive. The trouble began when the gap between obligations and revenues became persistent rather than cyclical. This is when Rome discovered the quiet power of monetary adjustment. By reducing the silver content in its coins, the state could meet its obligations without openly defaulting. Soldiers were paid, suppliers were compensated. The system continued to function. At first, this solution was nearly invisible. Coins looked the same. Trust remained intact. Over time, however, prices began to rise, wages lagged behind, and confidence slowly eroded. What's critical here is that Rome did not debase its currency out of greed or deception. It did so out of necessity. Each debasement was small. Each decision was framed as temporary. Each adjustment bought time, but time came at a cost. As currency lost value, soldiers demanded higher pay. Taxes had to rise further to compensate. Economic productivity declined as incentives weakened. The system became increasingly fragile, not because of one bad decision, but because of the accumulation of many rational ones. Rome entered a feedback loop where maintaining stability required measures that undermined stability over the long term. This is the stage where decline becomes difficult to recognize because daily life continues. Markets still operate, institutions still exist, the empire still looks powerful, yet underneath, flexibility disappears. When crises arise, responses become slower, more forceful, and less effective. This is where the comparison to modern America becomes uncomfortable. The United States did not accumulate debt because of irresponsibility. It accumulated debt because it faced extraordinary demands: global wars, economic collapse, demographic transitions, and the responsibilities of maintaining a global financial system. Like Rome, America's debt was manageable for decades because growth was strong, confidence was high, and the currency occupied a privileged position. The dollar, like Rome's coinage, was trusted not just domestically but globally. Creditors believed that future output would justify present borrowing. For a long time, they were right. But systems do not break when debt exists. They break when debt grows faster than the system's ability to service it without distortion. Rome reached that point quietly. Modern America is approaching a similar inflection, not because it lacks resources, but because its obligations have become structurally embedded. Interest payments consume an increasing share of revenue. Political incentives discourage meaningful reform. Cutting spending risks social instability. Raising taxes risks economic contraction. Borrowing feels easier than restructuring. Monetary solutions appear less painful than structural ones. This is where history begins to rhyme. Rome chose debasement because it allowed the state to function without confronting the full scale of its constraints. Modern systems choose inflation, financial repression, and regulatory complexity for the same reason. The language has changed, but the logic has not. Inflation is not merely a rise in prices. It is a mechanism that shifts burdens quietly. It reduces the real value of obligations while preserving the appearance of continuity. Rome understood this instinctively. Modern central banks understand it mathematically. The danger is not inflation itself, but dependence on it. Once a system relies on monetary adjustment to resolve structural imbalances, it becomes trapped. Each intervention creates expectations. Each stabilization measure increases future fragility. Rome's later leaders did not see themselves as stewards of decline. They believed they were preserving order in an increasingly complex world, and in the short term, they succeeded. The empire endured for centuries after its financial foundations weakened. But endurance is not the same as vitality. Roads deteriorated. Local governance fractured. Military effectiveness declined. The state became more coercive, not because it wanted to be, but because incentives no longer aligned voluntarily. This pattern matters today because modern decline, if it comes, will not look like collapse. It will look like stagnation, distortion, and increasing reliance on control mechanisms to manage outcomes that markets once handled organically. The United States still possesses extraordinary advantages: innovation, resources, global influence, and institutional depth. Rome also possessed immense advantages long after its peak. The question history asks is not whether a system is powerful, but whether it is adaptable. Rome struggled to reform because its political structures were designed for a different era. Modern democracies face similar challenges. Long-term reforms impose short-term costs, and short-term incentives dominate decision-making. Debt becomes a bridge between present comfort and future uncertainty. Over time, that bridge grows longer and weaker. The most important lesson from Rome is not inevitability, but trajectory. Rome did not fall because it failed to act. It fell because it acted in ways that postponed resolution while narrowing future options. Modern systems must choose between adjustment and distortion. Adjustment is painful but restorative. Distortion is painless at first but corrosive. Rome chose distortion repeatedly until adjustment was no longer possible. This is why Rome's story remains relevant. It reminds us that collapse is rarely dramatic. It is procedural. It happens when systems lose the ability to respond proportionally to stress. Debt, in this sense, is not a moral failure. It is a diagnostic tool. It tells you whether a system is investing in future capacity or borrowing against future stability. Rome eventually borrowed to preserve the present rather than build the future. When that shift occurred, decline became structural rather than cyclical. Whether modern America follows the same path is not predetermined. History does not repeat mechanically, but it does impose constraints. Incentives matter. Mathematics matters. Time matters. The warning from Rome is not that empires fall, but that they fall quietly first, long before anyone agrees on what to call it.